After going to one of the most bizarre and speculative panels I've ever been to at a comic convention, I just gotta say, I'm a little bit worried now for this untitled Gollum movie that Warner Brothers is planning. Despite bringing back together the OG team, complete with Peter Jackson, I'm now filled with a little bit of concern, and I think that it's time that we talk about adaptation yet again. Hi there everyone, Lars here from Camille's Harem, not just a podcast for novice writers by novice writers, but also a YouTube channel by novice writers for novice writers, because writing is an adventure, it's more fun with friends. And to just quickly get to it, adaptations happen in all kinds of forms. It's not just turning something into a movie or a television show. Adaptation is when you take a story from one medium and translate it on over into another one, and what you want to do with any good adaptation is that you want to take the best of that story and combine it with the strengths of a particular medium in order to elevate it to an all new status. Now, this might mean that some things are taken out, maybe some new things are put on in, depending on who is telling the story. And sometimes those additions are really good, and sometimes they're really bad. And it just comes down to how it is executed and how the audience receives it. It is a gamble, but as we've seen with the Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings films, when done well, it works out super good. It's just, the Lord of the Rings trilogy is indeed a modern classic. But then we look at the Hobbit movies, and well, while the Hobbit movies, speaking as a Tolkien fan, are entertaining to watch, it's so far removed from the story at points that just gets ridiculous. And some of the moments that they adapted, which were fan favorites from the book, just aren't done with the same kind of labor and care and love that we got from the Peter Jackson trilogy, despite all of the non-canonical things that go into the Jackson trilogy, and as a result, the Hobbit films are not remembered with as much fondness. Then compare that to the Rings of Power, which is just so far off the field that it's gone on over to the funny farm and is an absolute disaster. So with that little brief rundown review done, let's have a look on over at the proposed Gollum movie. A movie that will follow Smeagol, but really it's going to be following Gollum on his adventures from leaving the Misty Mountains, leaving Goblin Town, and going on his adventure to get revenge on Bilbo and get back his precious. And it will involve Gandalf and Aragorn and others hunting down Gollum. It should involve Sauron capturing Gollum, and will just set up everything from Gollum's perspective for the Fellowship of the Ring. And in theory, this actually isn't that bad of an idea. The only problem is that Tolkien didn't give us a whole lot of stuff to go off of, which means that there's going to be a lot of interpretation, a lot of new stuff thrown on in there, and this is where fan theory, fan speculation, corporate greed from Warner Brothers, and so many potential issues for just going so far afield, like the Rings of Power, just all comes together into this nasty mix and thrown into a corporate blender that could result in just absolute muck. Now, I'll be honest, at first when I heard the announcement for this, I was like, well, there's so many other things that I would rather you try to adapt, but if you're bringing together Andy Serkis and Viggo Mortensen and Peter Jackson and just the whole crew for a good movie, then you know what? I'm here for it. I'll let you guys have a shot. Let's see if the Lord of the Rings trilogy was truly lightning in a bottle, or if it can be replicated. And you know what? It'd be a fun last huzzah for Andy Serkis and Viggo Mortensen to come back to these characters, maybe even hopefully Ian McKellen, before time just takes these wonderful men away from us. I would like to see them have that shot. However, when I was at the Phoenix Fan Fusion and I was listening to a panel of people discuss based off of some of the things that they had heard, and then discussing with fans what they would want to have in a Gollum movie, it quickly spun out into all of this ridiculous nonsense. So I was like, wait a second, have you guys actually even read the books? I just want to make sure. I really wanted to ask that question. How many of you who are right now contributing to this conversation have actually read the Council of Elrond, or have read some of Tolkien's notes on Gollum? Because the character and the adventures that you are proposing have absolutely nothing to do with anything that Tolkien wrote for The Hunt for Gollum. Let me just quickly throw in a couple of things I was hearing. This is a story about coming terms to with death and with legacy. So what is the legacy of hunting for Gollum? Wait, where was any of that in anything that Tolkien wrote about this adventure? If anything, it's a horror story that is unloaded on Frodo and the elves when they hear, oh my gosh, this is what's going on, and Gollum has escaped. Oh no! Then other people are like, oh, this will be such a great opportunity to show the dynamic between Gimli and Gloin, and how there's this very antagonistic father and son relationship, which then leads to Gimli being a horrible dwarf until he meets Legolas, and then realizing that elves are okay, and then he meets Galadriel, and then realizes that everything is good. Wait a second. Wait, what? What gives you any indication that there was a very negative relationship between Gimli and Gloin? In fact, actually, again, when you read the book, you find out that Gloin is doing very well, other than wondering what the heck happened to Balin, and that Gimli would very much like to go to Moria to find out what happened to the colony that went to Moria. Other than that, there is no indication that there is some antagonism between father and son. Furthermore, introducing us to Gimli, who's supposed to be over at Mount Erebor, when we don't even get to Erebor with Gollum, then no. That doesn't make any sense. I'm sorry, but Gimli should not be in a story about hunting for Gollum. And there are people like, ooh, let's have how Legolas comes to terms with Thranduil. Wait a second. That's fanfiction material from the Hobbit movies. We don't really need to touch on that because it didn't actually give us all that much depth, if we're going to be all honest. And that was one of the more cringy moments of the Hobbit movies, especially when we realized that, oh, you created a fictional character to spin off this cringy love story that never happened. No, we don't need any of that stuff. In fact, if we just focus on what we know about the hunt for Gollum, that's going to be enough. Let's not worry about weird, nebulous themes of honor, death, and legacy, because that has actually nothing to do with Gollum. That's actually very far-flung from anything having to do with Gollum. On top of that, we don't need Gimli and Legolas so much within the story. If you want to have Legolas in the story, Legolas comes in at the end when Aragorn turns Gollum on over to the Elves of Mirkwood to put him into their custody, because he hopes that they can hold him hostage and at least give him some comfortable life while he's in prison, which unfortunately is what leads to Gollum actually escaping when Sauron realizes, so that's where my little sneak thief has gone to. Let's go kill some elves. So, as a fan of Tolkien, and as someone who took the time to actually crack open the book, go back to the book. Hey, J.D. Payne, Patrick McKay, how about you take your own advice to heart? Go back to the book and actually read the Council of Elrond and see what Gandalf and Aragorn and Legolas have to say about the hunt for Gollum. And based on the other notes that you can find within the trilogy about what Tolkien reveals about Gollum, either from Gollum's perspective or from the perspective of the narrator, as well as some of his other notes, this is what we know. Gollum eventually, driven by his need for the One Ring, left his caverns underneath Goblin Town and embarked on a journey to try to find Bilbo. During this hunt for Bilbo, Gollum was a menace upon the land. Gandalf even brings up how there were empty nests and empty cradles. Why does he bring that up? Because Gollum is pilfering the young, human and otherwise, and eating them along the way. He is a monster. And when I heard fans being all like, oh my gosh, it's going to be so great to see more of Smeagol. Yay, we love Smeagol. This is Gollum before the taming of Smeagol happens, both within the book and within the movies. Gollum is a pitiable being. That is true, but he is not yet a sympathetic one. He is a monster and a murderer who is clearly intent on killing Bilbo the moment he manages to find him. However, Gollum is having a really hard time of doing that. And in his process of trying to hunt down Bilbo, he goes far afield. He is drawn by a darker power towards Mordor. There he is caught by Sauron's servants, brought to Barad-dûr. There he is tortured and tormented for all the knowledge he has on the Shire. And when Sauron is finished with him, Sauron releases him back into the wild. Around this time, either before being captured or afterwards, is when Gollum discovers Shelob and begins worshipping her and forms a kind of pact with her for safe passage through her tunnels, so long as he provides her with food. But in any case, Gollum is freed, and now he is able to go once again after Bilbo, and Sauron is keeping an eye on Gollum to see where he goes, because they have no idea where the Shire is. Sauron doesn't know. And yes, in the movies, Shire Baggins! Yeah, you get that. But again, Sauron has no idea actually where the Shire is. And so he sends out the ring wraiths to go hunting. He is going to pester Saruman to tell him where. And just in case, let's see if the little sneak thief gets there first. Either way, Sauron believes that he's going to win by casting his net so wide. Well, lo and behold, Gandalf and Aragorn, who have been hunting for Gollum because Gandalf has been feeling really iffy about this magical ring that Bilbo has. Where could this ring have come from? What's its history? They finally go on the journey to capture Gollum. Aragorn captures Gollum while Gandalf is out studying over in Minas Tirith. He captures Gollum. Gollum bites him. They have rough words with each other. Gollum refuses to speak to Aragorn after that, and Aragorn then punts him all the way over to Mirkwood and hands him on over to the elves, where Gandalf then comes and interrogates Gollum in order to get the final confirming evidence that he needs to then go and test the One Ring back at Bag End. And so the elves of Mirkwood take Gollum on in, and they're kind to him. They let him climb trees. They keep a close eye on him. But Sauron knows that where Gollum is at, and so devises a plan to once again unleash Gollum upon his enemies. And he does this by coordinating on a purely black night, a massive raid of orcs who come down from the mountains, attack the elves, and chase Gollum into the remains of Dol Guldur, which are once again infested with all kinds of monsters, necromancers, and other kinds of nightmares. And there Gollum is freed completely from the influence of the elves and is once again sent packing on his journey to try to find Bilbo, where he then gets lost in the mines of Moria and boom, runs into the Fellowship. And there you have it. That's the story of the hunt for Gollum. Now, what can be done in an adaptation? I think that a strong adaptation for The Hunt for Gollum, if this is indeed the story that Warner Brothers and Peter Jackson and Andy Serkis wants to do, I think a good way of doing this would be to kind of have two separate stories going on. One is of Gollum's hunt for the ring, and we get to see him on that personal, grueling, disgusting, dark journey, build him up indeed as a monster, as a pitiable monster who goes through all of this, and then have that play in good contrast with what we know will happen in the Lord of the Rings trilogy, where Frodo shows him pity and releases him from his bonds and allows for Sméagol to come on out, and thereby allowing us to finally sympathize with Gollum and showing that there might just be a chance for saving Gollum, which is very important for Frodo's character, because if Frodo can save Gollum from the influence of the One Ring, then hopefully that means for Frodo that by the end of this journey, he too can be saved from the influence of absolute evil, which as we see is the bittersweet ending of the Lord of the Rings, where that's not the case. Frodo succumbs to evil, and Frodo can find no rest anymore in Middle-earth after his quest, and therefore must leave to go to Valinor. And it is a beautiful arc when you think about it that way. And then, running parallel to this darker story with Gollum, I would like to see the adventures of Gandalf, Aragorn, and maybe even throw in some of the Rangers of the North or some of the Elves of Mirkwood in their journey to find Gollum. So that way then we can have some great action against monsters and orcs and other people. You can then see some of these darker locales from another perspective. And of course then Gollum being captured, and that making sense because you know who the dynamic duo has been, who has been hunting Gollum. And yeah, sure, that's going to take a lot of work. You're going to have to fill in a ton of gaps with hopefully good writing, good character development, stuff that Tolkien did not provide, once again. So this is definitely going to be a study in strong writing or weak writing from Peter Jackson's own crew. Do they have it within them to actually be Tolkien enough to provide a good Tolkien-like view into this darker aspect of his world and of his characters and of his greater narrative, and not become too much like gratuitous fan fiction? That is the challenge before Peter Jackson, Andy Serkis, and company as they embark on making this movie. And I do have hopes that they can do it really well, but the danger is there. The questions are there. And by being at this Fan Fusion panel, I realized that many fans of the movies and of the books have seemingly forgotten that Gollum is a villain, and instead they just remember that Andy Serkis made him a very sympathetic character and that there's a lot of humor to him under the right circumstances, and so that's what they're expecting, rather than the monster that Tolkien wrote him to be, and that he is 100%, though pitiable, he is still a murderous monster until Frodo goes the extra mile in trying to save Gollum from himself and allows the goodness, or the relative goodness, that is Smeagol to finally bubble up to the surface and have a chance at redemption. So those are all things that Peter Jackson, Andy Serkis, and company are going to have to keep in mind as they embark on this story. It is a very tall order, and again, I have faith that they can do it. But understanding that such a tall order, I will also understand if it falls short of expectations. And I think that fans as well need to kind of not necessarily temper their expectations, but rather make sure that they have informed expectations based on what Tolkien wrote, because Tolkien did give us enough information to understand this story, its context within the wider world, and greater events for the War of the One Ring. And when we have that, I think that fans can be better prepared for what this story ought to be, or what it could be. And then we'll have to judge it based on what we get when it finally comes out. So, those are my thoughts on a potential Gollum movie. I'd love to hear what yours are. Do you think that Peter Jackson and company can pull off a miracle yet again, or is this simply doomed to failure? What are some things that you would hope to see in an adaptation of The Hunt for Gollum? And yeah, again, I want to hear all of that in the comments below. But in the meantime, as we wait to see if Peter Jackson can pull off lightning in a bottle yet again, if you're looking for great stories that have nothing to do with all of this bizarre fan fiction that Hollywood is obsessed with, then please check out some of the books that I have published. Links for them are in the description below. But otherwise, I am so grateful that you've joined us on this incredible adventure that we call writing. And until the next video, y'all, tschüss.